Okay, so this week will be Purim. So I thought I'd give a share on Purim to explain what's going on and so on. You know, when you look at the Megillah and you read the story of Purim, it's a very strange story. In fact, it doesn't make any sense at all. The whole story doesn't make any sense. First of all, it doesn't make sense what the Jews did to deserve almost genocide, because what you have here is a situation where a whole people were supposed to be murdered. That's very unusual. The unusual concept is that somebody was willing to murder a whole people just for the sake of money. And that was Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus seemed to want to kill all the Jews because he was paid a certain amount of money. Obviously, it was a huge amount of money from Haman. So the question is, since all things are from God, what did the Jews do really to deserve that Inish? That they should all be wiped out. Never before in history, except in Egypt, were all the Jews in one area. The whole nation was in one country, one area. So they were subject to total genocide. Throughout history, the Jews have always been scattered. Basically, the essence of Jews are that they are scattered. They are scattered among the nations of the world. And they're never located in just one area of the world where they're subject to a genocide and so on. But the question, now that they were all in one area of the world in the Persian Empire, why did suddenly heaven, which proclaimed that fundamentally the Jews will be there guaranteed for Olam Haba, suddenly want to liquidate every Jew in Persia, or almost every Jew in Persia? Another question is, we have a situation with Haman. Haman wants to annihilate the Jews. Okay, why? Because Mordechai failed to honor him in the way that he thought he deserved to be honored. So he sort of wanted to be worshipped like a god, that his power made him equivalent to almost a divine figure. And of course, Mordecai refused that. So Haman would see Mordecai as an enemy. Okay, so you see him as an enemy. But instead, Haman decides to kill all the Jews, not only Mordecai. And that kind of behavior is somewhat psychotic, where a person sees the representation of Mordechai for all the Jewish people and wants to annihilate the Jewish people. That doesn't make any sense. And it's absolutely amazing that he goes over. I mean, it's embarrassing that Haman, the prime minister of Persia, goes over to the king of Persia, Ahasuerus, and says, hey, how'd you like to make a business deal? How'd you like to sell me all your Jews? Yeah, and I'll give you a lot of money per Jew, and so on, and you'll cooperate with me. And Ahasuerus says, okay, how much you willing to offer me? And whatever it is, they agree upon a certain quantity, a certain amount, and he signs away the Jews. You've never heard of such a principle. Ever since the Nazis in World War II, that concept does not exist, where a king is willing to send fundamentally his citizens for cash. So how was the whole deal constructed? What is the nature of the deal? It doesn't seem to be something in a human enterprise. And then the next thing, what Ahasuerus does, Ahasuerus is shocked that Esther is suddenly included in this deal. Well, he was shocked, but he was the one that was part of the deal. He was the one that actually agreed with Haman to do it. And he wasn't shocked about that, you see. To such an extent that two people who are actually criminal minds and agreed on a completely unusual criminal activity, suddenly he becomes moral, and he rejects the idea of including Esther into this pact, and then he goes ahead and he kills his prime minister. I mean, if you want to back out of a deal, you return the money to Haman, right? You simply return his money, and you say, well, I've decided to recant. I've decided not to do it. Okay, I can understand that. Instead, Ahasuerus seems to go into a rage, and suddenly he says, well, that's it. Haman goes to the hangman. Now, that doesn't make sense. Haman must have been an effective prime minister, or he would not have been appointed by Ahasuerus. You know, Ahasuerus was no fool, and therefore the people that he appointed for his government in certain ways must have been very competent people. And Haman must have been very competent to achieve the post of prime minister. So what happens here? Suddenly, Ahasuerus becomes so angry that he wants to kill Haman, and so on. And what's even more shocking is that he wants to kill Haman and replace him with the very person that Haman wanted to kill. He wants to replace him with a Jew. Wait a minute, I can understand that Haman hated the Jews, but I can't understand why Ahasuerus was willing to appoint Mordechai, as a substitute for Haman, so he should become prime minister. So what kind of story is this? You know what I mean? And finally, Chazal, our sages, say to us, well, Esther says, I think you should write this whole thing down as a story in the Megillah and make this a Purim, make this a Yontov for all time to commemorate this whole event. Well, this whole event was not miraculous. There was nothing in the event that indicated any kind of miracle. It was simply a story. So what Esther says, let's make this story a national treasure. What? Let's make this one story, which sounds like the ramblings of psychotics, into a story that will be there for the Jews for all time. Not only that, the Torah says that the only holiday which will be left after the Mashiach comes, guess what? Is not the story of Pesach, which is a story really of the formation of the Jewish people as a whole. Right? The most important holiday fundamentally from a historical perspective is Pesach, because we became a nation on Pesach, and when we went from Mitzrayim to Har Sinai to receive the Torah. So instead, what becomes the main story of the Jewish people is what? Is the story of Purim, which may be interesting in a certain way, even if it did make sense. But that story of what happened with Esther and Mordechai, this whole story and with Haman and so on, this was stories of a personal event. It was a personal event, essentially, that eventually affected the whole Jewish people. But it was a personal event that happened to be between Ahasuerus the king, his prime minister Haman, Esther, who was the wife of Mordechai, and Mordechai and so on. And it turned out to be this way. There's something extremely unusual about this whole thing. The story on the surface does not make sense. And the Chazal should make it a national holiday. Not only that, God should see this holiday as the forerunner of the Messianic period is absolutely astonishing. So frankly, the whole thing doesn't make sense at all. So therefore, no one seems to really think about this. Everyone is running around giving out their Hamantaschen, their matnas who have joined them and so on. And it's a cute holiday and so on. There's a certain amount of joy, whatever's left that Klal Yisrael can feel, and that's it. And this becomes the most sacred holiday of all time. It doesn't really compute. And it doesn't really make sense in terms of what happens. So I would like to go over the same story of Purim and give it a different flavor, which I think is the real event of Purim and what really happened. And you find some of this information in the Medrash. You find it in the Agarit of Gemara. When you piece it together, suddenly the thing looks like a completely different story. And there's something about it. The whole story really rests on what's called the continuity of the Jewish people. The Jewish people are not simply a nation composed of a certain ethnic group. That's not what they are. The history of the Jews is not like the history of Europe or the history of Africa or the history of Asia and so on. It's not simply an ethnic group, but fundamentally is the one people that seem to represent the will of God, in the sense that God created beings who somewhat similar to him, that this being is extremely exalted, as I've been pointing out recently in all the shurim. And God wanted to coexist with this being through all time, and not only that, through all eternity. So everything which happens on the planet Earth in some way happens through the Jews. They are the center of the whole message of human history. So in some way, this story of Purim must relate to the whole concept of human history. So we have to look at the period of time when Persia took over Babylonia and so on. The essential incident, which is the central incident of human history at that time, was the destruction of the temple. Now, why is the temple being destroyed so grand, so powerful? What does it mean? What does it mean that the Jews have a temple, fundamentally, which is kind of a doorway or a corridor between heaven and earth? Because the significance of the Beis HaMikdash, or the temple, is a building that houses the Hashuros HaShrina, the Shrina, which is somehow the presence of God in the physical universe and in the spiritual universe. The building of the temple, of the Beis HaMikdash, and so on, seems to represent the habitation or the occupation of God in the physical universe. And through this temple, the Jews relate to God. That's the way they interact with him. And fundamentally, this seems to be a worldwide event. Why? Because it wasn't the temple itself, the Beis HaMikdash, which was so critical. It's the fact that people relate to the Shekhinah. There's a personal relationship with people to the Shekhinah. Why? Because the construction of Olam Haba, or eternity, has to do with the relationship that we have with the Shekhinah. God originally says, "V'shochanti b'soicham," and I will dwell among them. And the word "v'shochanti," which is the verb, means that I will dwell. And God says, "I will dwell in their midst." What does that mean? That means that the Shekhinah is the medium in which Jews feel the existence of Olam Haba. Olam Haba, which is nothing more than eternity, is a consciousness of a person where he's completely conscious of the existence and the power of God. That is the essence of his relationship with Rebbeinu Shalom. And therefore, the Shekhinah is the intermediary between that. When Chazal describe Olam Haba, they say fundamentally what? They describe the Olam Haba as the Nenem B'Ziva Shekhinah. That the person, the Zulosoi, or the conscious mind of the Zulosoi, appreciates and absorbs the presence of God. And that's where the pleasure of Olam Haba comes from. It's a super sacred state of the human mind, where suddenly he goes up from being a physical being to becoming a spiritual being. And then from becoming a spiritual being to becoming an eternal being, where there's no more time, space, or action. So the essence of a Jew is his fundamental, final relationship with God through the medium of the Shekhinah. And this Shekhinah really was supposed to inhabit the heart and mind of every Jew. So therefore, the relationship of a Jew to a Shekhinah is Olam Haba. It is the very essence of what Olam Haba. And it is fundamentally the area in which God manifests his Hatova, his goodness, to that which is what? To that which is the Zulosoi. So originally the Shekhinah was supposed to be in the heart of every Jew. And in connecting with that Shekhinah, he is in Olam Haba, which is eternal. The only reason why the Shekhinah is now invested in the Beis HaMikdash is because of the sin of the golden calf. Because the Beis HaMikdash represents an aspect of distance, whereas originally the Shekhinah was supposed to be in the heart of the Jew and in his mind, and connect him to eternity, to coexisting with God on a certain level. The Shekhinah suddenly became distant, and what you really felt it was the Shekhinah was now on a physical domain, on a house, on a building. And this was a drop from what Olam Haba, the relationship of Jews to the Beis HaMikdash was a mini Olam Haba, because in Olam Haba they will relate to God in much more of a direct way, because their conscious mind should be filled with the habitation of God in them. And therefore, in a certain sense, they would be in a madrega called Olam Haba. But this completely changed after the sin of the golden calf, when now the Shekhinah suddenly distances itself from them, and now is in a specific domain. The Shekhinah is not merged with consciousness, but it's merged with a location, with a specific area where it has boundaries and definition, which is called the Beis HaMikdash. The main function of the Beis HaMikdash was not simply to indicate the location of the Shekhinah, but it was to create the possibility of atonement through the avodah of the Mizbeach, of the altar, where Klal Yisrael sacrificed what? They sacrificed korbanos and so on, which would relieve them of the sins that they committed. And it was these sacrifices which was the ikar of the Beis HaMikdash. What happened? Well, what happened was the Jews did not even deserve to even have that relationship with the Shekhinah. And the Shekhinah was torn away, which means that the place of residence, which is the Beis HaMikdash, was destroyed. The destruction of the temple is the destruction of the corridor between physicality and spirituality. But more than that, it was really the corridor between time, existence in time, to existence in non-time or eternity. The Beis HaMikdash was really a doorway between Olam Hazeh, the physical and spiritual universe, and Olam Haba, the eternal universe. So the fact that the Jews suddenly did things that caused God to destroy the Beis HaMikdash meant that it seems to be they would be cut off from their ultimate destiny, which is Olam Haba. Who did this? Well, this task was given to Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king. And eventually Babylonia went to war with Persia, and Persia took over. So the Jews became subjects of the Persian king. But the captivity in Babylon and the captivity in Persia really represented a stopgap. It represented some kind of disconnection between Olam Hazeh and Olam Haba itself. It was not simply a punishment of the Jews. It was a punishment where their original destination was canceled or temporarily suspended. So therefore, the event of the Jews losing the Beis HaMikdash was far more serious than what we imagine. They didn't simply lose a temple, they lost God. God went a distance. He was now at a great distance from them. And the fact that the temple was destroyed meant that their destiny was halted. So therefore, the Golus of Persia was a serious matter, very serious matter. Now, Yirmiyahu Hanavi said that even though God distanced himself from the Jewish people, this was only a temporary distance. God would return, and the connection between Olam Hazeh and Olam Haba would be reinstated. In other words, their destiny would be reinstated and recaptured. And he said that this would take place for 70 years. 70 years later, they would come back. So therefore, what Yirmiyahu was saying was extremely important, because the Beis HaMikdash was not simply a temple where you give sacrifices, but the Beis HaMikdash represented the fundamental permanent condition where the Jews related to the Shina, which was fundamentally the relationship they would have in Olam Haba. So therefore, that Beis HaMikdash represented the destiny of all of mankind, all of the physical world, everything related to that specific destiny. So we're talking about something which is the center of existence. The central activity of all existence is to be worthy of getting to Olam Haba through the Tikkun of Dam Sufa. And that would be represented, at least temporarily, by the relationship that the Jews had with the Beis HaMikdash. So the fact that they were in Persia meant a cessation to that goal, that destiny. Now Achashverosh was the king of Persia, and Persia was the mightiest empire in the world at that time, having taken over Babylonia and so on. And it was the mightiest empire in the world. It's one of the largest empires that was ever constructed, was the nation that captured the Jews. So fundamentally, its captivity of the Jews represented a cessation of the creation of Olam Haba itself. It wasn't simply that the Jews lived in another country, but they lived in another state of being, where the destination of Olam Haba would be suspended. So Achashverosh knew about the prophecy of Yirmiyahu Hanavi, and he knew that the Jews are not a simple people, that their prophets were very great men, and in some way their prophets were in contact with the divine being, with God himself. So when Yirmiyahu Hanavi says that the Jews will be for 70 years, 70 years they would be in exile without a Beis HaMikdash, but the Beis HaMikdash will be returned after 7 years, it would affect the Persian Empire. Because it means that if the Jews go back to Eretz Yisrael and rebuild a temple to a second temple, the concept of rebellion would infiltrate his various nations. And he controlled 127 countries. And therefore the thought of rebellion becoming independent would have been contagious. So he was very worried about it. It could symbolize the end of Persia. So he counted the years. And he was the king of Persia during the years of exile. But he made a mistake. He thought that the 70th year arrived, but it really didn't. It was the 69th year. And it was 1 year before the prophecy of Yirmiyahu will be fulfilled, where the Jews will be free enough to begin the journey back to Israel to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. But in any case, he thought that That the 70th year was that year, and therefore he made a very great seudah, a very great party, a feast. And the party was made why? It wasn't a commemoration of anything Persian. It was commemoration of the victory over the Jews. That Olam Hazeh would not turn into Olam Haba, but Olam Hazeh would have a kiyum. So therefore, he made a huge party, and to asseverate the state that he will be king, until he dies. He wanted to indicate this to the world, so he made a party which lasted many, many days. And not only that, the main part of his party was to invite the Jews. Now, when he invited the Jews, he knew the Jews ate only kosher meat. And the Medrash says, comparing to Rabbi Eliezer, that Achashverosh provided kosher food. That's right. He provided the Jews kosher food. But fundamentally, it was a false kind of invitation, because that party was not designed to honor the Jews. It was designed to shame the Jews, because the party was made because he was declaring to them, I am the winner. You are the loser. You are not going anywhere for any time away from the Persian Empire. Now, the Jews fundamentally knew this. And at the Suda itself, Achashverosh put down vessels of gold and silver from the temple. So he actually put it in front of their face that they would not be going back to Israel. Mordechai told the Jews not to go to the party, because this party was a commemoration of their embarrassment, of their humiliation. But instead the Jews went, because the food was kosher. There was nothing asa about the party. There was no specific halacha that would make them away from the party, so they wanted to go. But in doing that, by participating in the party of Achashverosh, they participated in their own humiliation. They participated in their own destruction. They were celebrating the destruction of the temple and the loss of the temple with Achashverosh. And Mordechai said to them, fundamentally, are you crazy? You are celebrating your actual destruction. But they didn't listen, because they had a good life in Persia. Persia was not really a very bad exile, whereas Babylonia was much worse. In Babylonia, Nebuchadnezzar forced the Jews, or tried to force them, a lot of them, to worship his idols, Marduk, and so on, and Ishtar. So the Babylonian captivity was much worse. But Persia, having conquered Babylonia, didn't force the Jews to worship the gods of Persia. I think it was the Zoroastrian religion or whatever it was. The Jews were fundamentally free to worship their God as they chose. They were not compelled to worship Avodah Zarah. So therefore, they had a good time. The exile was fundamentally not bad. So therefore, they wanted to honor Achashverosh, that he's much more lenient. They wanted to indicate their appreciation of Achashverosh, that he's much more lenient with them. And they were very thankful. So fundamentally, they decided that they would go. So here you had a very strange situation, because the Jews appreciated the Golus of Persia, because it was much easier than they thought it would be, and it became easier. Why did God transfer the Golus of Bavel to the Golus of Persia? Because it was getting easier. as you get closer to your Yeshua, the Golus becomes a little easier. So the Golus of Persia was much easier than the Golus of Babel. But the fact that the whole party was constructed, was made to commemorate the destruction of the temple, and so on and so forth, and that Achashverosh would remain king for as long as he lived, didn't concern the Jews. So, of course, this event had worldwide implications, meaning that had implications in the Shemayim in heaven. The Satan, who's the Malach Adin, went over to God and said to him, these are the people that you want to rebuild the temple? Is this a joke? Look at these people. They don't honor you in any sense. Maybe they're from, but they don't honor you because they are sitting with Achashverosh celebrating the fact that the temple was destroyed. So suddenly the Malach Adin won that case. And what do you do to a people who completely celebrate their defeat? What do you do to such a people who participate in celebrating their defeat and the defeat of their destiny? You simply take away, you cancel their destiny. So God said, okay, you're right. And therefore I'm going to punish the Jews this time with complete destruction, and they will all die, similar to the Jews in Egypt. 80% of the Jews in Egypt did not go out. They died in Egypt under the plague of Choshech. That's right, 80%. So God decided to punish them. And hence now starts the story of Purim. The sin of Purim doesn't just happen. It wasn't some kind of random event. It was a punishment for the Jews because they betrayed their destiny. They betrayed their identity. So suddenly Haman becomes the central figure. Now, what it says, Haman somehow became prime minister. How he became prime minister, I have no idea. But he became the prime minister of the Persian Empire. And my God, that is a position to be envious of, and so on, and so on. But what the Medrash says, what it seems to be indicating, the Medrash says, is that Haman actually knew Mordechai before they went to Persia. He knew Mordechai before. In some inferior capacity. He was some kind of subordinate of to Mordechai. He was either a servant or he was barber. I don't know exactly what exactly. I don't remember exactly what was being said. But Haman knew Mordechai before they went to Persia. And Haman, who was an Amalekite, had a supreme form of arrogance. Amalek is noted for what? It's not noted for its hatred of the Jews. There are many countries that hate the Jews. But it's noted for the fact that they can feel the grandeur and the importance of the Jews in their soul. And they feel that the Jew is absolute competition and a true enemy of them. Because Amalek is known as a nation that would have nothing to do with God, that would seek their own power. So Haman was in a very bad shape, that he was a subordinate to Mordechai even before he became prime minister of Persia. So once he became the prime minister of Persia, he expected Mordechai to recognize his new position and his new stature, and therefore he would bow to Haman in complete recognition of how important he was. But he didn't do that, fundamentally, because you don't bow to another human being. You don't recognize another person as in any sense as some kind of divine power just because he's the prime minister. I mean, you bow your head, maybe you say like a hello and so on in terms of respect. But Haman expected complete obeisance, a complete recognition of the power of Haman, which of course Mordecai didn't want to give. So therefore Haman was enraged, and now it makes sense. Haman wasn't enraged because one Jew didn't refuse to honor him the way he wanted. That's actually psychotic behavior. You know, some person who thinks, some paranoid schizophrenic who thinks that he's God. But Haman thought that now was the time that, what do you call it, Mordecai would have to agree that Haman was a very great man. So instead of looking at Haman in a subordinate way, he would have to recognize Haman as his superior. And that's what he expected. So it was a kind of a personal thing between him and Mordecai. It wasn't simply a person who refused to recognize the ultimate stature of the prime minister. It was actually personal. So when Mordecai refused to recognize Haman in the way he wanted, he became furious, because this was a double jeopardy. Not only was Haman seen as an inferior and a subordinate to Mordecai before he became prime minister, but even after he became prime minister, Mordecai continued to see him that way. Maybe he would honor him in a certain sense, but he continued to see him. The reason why he hated Mordecai, because he didn't want Mordecai to look at his position of power. It wasn't the fact that he was a prime minister that he wanted Mordecai to see him. He wanted Mordecai to recognize his superior status. It was much more personal. I'm not the guy you thought I was, Haman thought. I'm much greater. I am a prime minister. I am the second power in Persia. That's what. So he demanded as a redefinition of who he was, not simply a salutation in terms of seeing him in a certain way. And when Mordecai refused to give him that salutation, he was enraged. Because of course he understood why. Because the Jewish people have these values, these strange values, where they only recognize God as the only superior being. So therefore what Haman hated was not the person Mordecai. What Haman hated was the value. The fact that he would not give him any honor other than the fact that his office would demand a certain honor as being a prime minister. But he would not value who Haman was as a person, as almost a godlike being. So therefore, Haman thought that he has to eliminate this value. And since Mordecai represented the value of this feeling, he would have to annihilate the Jewish people. But see, Haman was no fool. He had a certain understanding of who a Jew was. And he understood that there are not a simple people to control. So therefore, how could he eliminate the Jewish people? The only way he understood how to eliminate the Jewish people is to use God as his ally. What? He would have to make God his ally. That it's not him who wants to destroy the Jews. He would have to convince God that it was God himself would want to annihilate that. Wow. Haman was a pretty smart guy. So what he did was, he didn't know what the Jews were doing, but he knew that the Jews would do some kind of sin, or they have done some kind of sin, which will be really counted against them. So that's why what he did, he drew lots. There's a certain thing called lots, which is through the art of divination. When you look at the structure of a certain event, and you analyze the structure of the event, and so on, and you see from the event itself what the psychic possibilities are. Haman knew how to do this because he was an Amalekite, and they had this information. So he had to determine, did the Jews ever do anything that would warrant their destruction? So what he did, if they did, when would they be vulnerable? When would they be vulnerable by the Midas Hadin? You know, God himself would say that he would want to annihilate the Jews. So therefore, he drew lots in some way, and each month he drew a lot, in terms of Teves, Shvat, and so on, all the months of the year. And suddenly, on the month of Adar, the lot responded, yes, in this month the Jews would become vulnerable. And then he drew the lots for the days. And then he saw that on the 14th day of Adar would be a certain kitrug that would apply to the Jews. And because that kitrug, that accusation, would apply to the Jews, God would therefore take care of the Jews. He would sentence them all to death. So that's the concept of Purim. Purim means lots, because by using the lots, you can actually determine the vulnerability in heaven of your destiny. You can see what your mazel is. So Haman saw that the Jews were destined for annihilation at a certain time. So therefore, he used that time to plan the destruction of the Jews. In other words, Haman knew he couldn't kill the Jews by himself. But God would have to assist him in that. And that's how you do that, by knowing the existence of ketugim, or accusations against the Jews, when they occurred. He would have God as an ally. And that's the tradition of Amalek. Amalek understands something very deep that most nations do not understand, and you have to give them credit. Where does Amalek come from? Amalek comes from, he was the grandson of Esav. And one thing he learned from Esav, that the Jews have the blessing of Yitzchak, and therefore the Jews will always be superior to the descendants of Esav. But when the Jews start to sin, that would be their vulnerability. Then suddenly the Ketrugim would go against the Jews and allow possibly their annihilation. So what you have to do when you want to fight the Jews is not get swords and weapons. That's not what's going to kill Jews, because Jews have a miraculous way to survive. What you have to do is you have to figure out the Ketrugim. You have to know the structure of Kitrug, how accusations are made against the Jews, and when they are applied. And that's the time you have to attack them, because that's the time that they will be vulnerable. So therefore, Haman applied a spiritual path to annihilate the Jews. This was not simply a war. This was a war in heaven, where Amalek now can use the power of heaven itself against the Jews. And he learned that from Esav. He learned that from his forefathers, that the only way to kill the Jews is to find out when the Ketrugim would be at their greatest. And he did that through the concept of lots, Purim. And therefore, that's what Purim tells us, that the Jews are always at certain points in their existence under a vulnerability of being punished. And the only way they'll be victorious over the Jews is to find out when that would be. And at that point, you suddenly can control the destiny of the Jews. So this was a spiritual war. This was not a war of people. It was not a historical war. It was a supernatural war. And that's what you have to understand. This was not a simple war. It was a supernatural war. So therefore, Haman thought of the idea, well, if the Jews are vulnerable to be annihilated on the 14th day of Adar, let me get what? Let me get Achashverosh, the king, to tell him this. He made this deal with Achashverosh. Now, why would Achashverosh want to do this? No king ever sold their citizens, the people of their empire, sold them for cash, sold them for money to be annihilated. It just doesn't make sense. Why would Achashverosh agree to such an insane deal? Very simple. Because the Jews were already an enemy to Achashverosh. They was enemy because he knew that they would have to go back to the land of Israel based on the prophecy of Yirmiyahu. They would have to go back to the land of Israel and rebuild a temple. So the Jews were already a bone in his neck. and he was continuously conscious of the possible ascendancy of the Jews, where he would lose them. So now that he saw that the Jews, what? He would not lose them because they were now under his captivity, since the prophecy of Yirmiyahu would not take place. When Haman walked over and offered them, he said, good, I could use this plan because now I don't ever have to worry again. It's true that the Jews will rebuild the temple eventually, but not now, and I have them now. But I will get rid of this problem forever. How? Because now I no longer have to worry about the prophecy of Yirmiyahu, and they are people who are totally useless. So I might as well benefit from this and sell them for money. That's why Achashverosh agreed. He agreed to do something to his citizens of his own country, which no king ever did until the Nazis. He simply thought, well, since the Jews are anyway my enemies, and they are always a threat to me, now I have an opportunity not only to get rid of them, to get rid of my enemy, but to benefit from it. Because in some way, Haman was able to supply the money. How he got that money, I don't know. But Haman was obviously a very rich man, that he was able to buy all the Jews and take possession of them and sell them fundamentally to Achashverosh and his kingdom. So this convinced Achashverosh to do the deal. So now we have a situation which is very dangerous for the Jews. There was now an Amalekite who was after them that knew how to fight a spiritual war, a supernatural war against them. Not only that, he knew the Jews were the enemies of Achashverosh, and Achashverosh therefore would see the value of selling them to be destroyed. So everything was working out, and suddenly the Jews were under a captivity of doing this. So now we understand the story of Purim, how it occurred. We understand the sin of the Jews at that time, and we understand the concept of why Haman was so angry at the Jews, and why Achashverosh agreed to get rid of the Jews. Suddenly the story begins to make sense. But the essence is that it's a supernatural war. Finally, what happens? Esther, who was fundamentally married to Mordechai, she was his niece, and she was somewhat married to him, that it's called the Medrash, she was married to him and so on, becomes queen. And then suddenly, Mordechai says, I know of this gezerah, that now we are sold to Achashverosh, not as slaves. We are sold to be killed. But did Mordechai know this for sure? No. So you see an amazing thing, because Mordechai said that he heard of this gezerah. And it's possible that Esther was now the queen of Persia, and she was in a position that she could help. But he didn't really know, because it says he didn't really know that this was a possibility. But he said this could be a possibility. And now he suddenly saw and he realized that there was a purpose to Esther being the queen of Persia. And maybe that purpose was to save the Jews. You cannot save yourself, because you will be destroyed with the Jews and so on. But it's possible, the reason why you're queen of Persia is that you can save them. So in other words, you see something very interesting. The kittug against the Jews was so powerful that Mordechai, which is obviously a Navi, could not see the way to save them as a definite thing. The kittug against the Jews was so powerful, the accusation against the Jews was so powerful. The fact that the Jews humiliated the Beis HaMikdash by attending the Seudah of Achashverosh was so powerful that Mordechai was not sure, but he said to Esther, it seems to be that you are in the right place at the right time. Therefore, you must act. Esther realized that this is happening for the Jews, not Stam. This was not because of Stam. The Jews obviously had done something terrible to deserve this destiny. So she said, the most important thing of all, what is the fundamental thing? That the Jews have no Achdus. They didn't have an Achdus, so they were considered a unified people under the Beis HaMikdash. So what she said to Mordechai, Knesses Kol Yehudim, gather them all together as a unit. Esther understood that the power of the Jew lies in their unity. And that was one of the main reasons why the Kitruk even was effective. Because the Jews never really demonstrated unity, only at certain points in time. So she said the only way to stop this gezerah is that the Jews daven as a unified nation, all under the same destiny. But if they daven as separate peoples, each one for their own life and the life of their family, they will never succeed. It is only the Achdus, when the Jews have this Achdus, that suddenly they become a power. And this is something that the Jews really don't understand. They don't understand that their power lies in their unity, in being a single organism that represents God. And only in that capacity could they accomplish things which are miraculous. So she said, Knais, assemble them all together, make them a unified people where there's no sinas chinam, and so on. And then when they pray to God, it will be able to be answered, and then I will be able to possibly go to Achashverosh and take care of it. So Esther clearly identified, maybe even more than Mordechai, but she identified the true power of what a Jew is, that the power of a Jew lies in his Achdus with Klal Yisrael, and he loses it when there is no Achdus. And therefore she was only willing to take the risk of seeing Achashverosh and not be killed, because it was without his permission, when the Jews are unified. So what happened? So she went to Achashverosh, and lo and behold, he had chen for her. He suddenly became soft, and he said, "Yeah, what is it you want?" In other words, and so on. So she said to him, what? She said that he should make a party with her and the prime minister. Now it's obviously she included the prime minister because he was the prime minister. Haman was the prime minister. So therefore, this would be a party of elites, of royalty, of only royal figures. Achashverosh the king, and what do you call it? And Haman the prime minister, and so on. And she wanted to do this and honor them both in terms of having a party that they would both attend. But on the second party that she said, she revealed to Achashverosh something that he was shocked, because Achashverosh did not know that Esther was Jewish. She surely didn't know that she was married to Mordechai, because if he knew that, he would have Mordechai killed, similar to what Avraham Avinu had with Sarah when they went into Egypt. The reason why Avraham Avinu said he was Sarah made his relative, he didn't say he was her husband, because he knew then that they would kill him and free Sarah from her husband. So Mordechai also understood that if Achashverosh knew when he was looking for a new wife that she already had a husband, he would obviously have that husband killed. So therefore he concealed the fact that she was even related to him and that she was Jewish. So what happened when she declared that Haman wanted to kill her and all the people and that she was Jewish? She revealed to Achashverosh that she was a Jew and that she was included in the gezerah, in the contract between him and Haman. What did Achashverosh think? Well, obviously, whatever he thought was so enraging that he actually decided to kill Haman, which means he saw in this a plot of Haman against him in some way. In other words, what he observed was not simply that Haman wanted to kill the Jews, but in some way Haman wanted to do something to Ahasuerus himself and take something from him or do something to him, which indicated treason. He saw the accusation of treason to Haman. And now it's not stated what that is, but I believe in some way that Haman wanted Esther for his own wife. And knowing that Esther was Jewish, by condemning all the Jewish people, finally Ahasuerus would have to kill his own wife, which would leave her completely vulnerable. And in that state of vulnerability, Haman would say, well, I can grant her an exception, because Ahasuerus could not have because he signed the document. He signed the fact that the Jews were given over to Haman. So it was Haman who bought her, who had the rights to Esther. And in that right, he could have taken Esther as his wife, was an accomplished thing. So therefore, Ahasuerus suddenly understood that part of the plot to kill the Jews was to take away his beloved Esther, because on a certain level he loved Esther. So there's the possibility that Haman actually wanted Esther, because Haman knew Esther was Jewish. Haman knew Mordechai before they went to Persia. And he obviously knew Esther, who lived in his household. So he probably knew that Esther was Jewish and Ahasuerus didn't. So he would get Ahasuerus to condemn all the Jews, including Esther. And therefore, he would have the right to take Esther from him and marry her. This possibly could be one of the reasons. And Ahasuerus suddenly understood that this was not simply selling Jews. This was simply selling Jews and taking something from him. This was treason against the king. So that's why Ahasuerus said, who is this? What are you trying to do? You're trying to steal my own wife? You're trying to get me to kill what? Because it doesn't make sense. Why was Ahasuerus so angry at Haman? Because he wanted to kill the Jews. He himself was a partner to the crime. He signed a document enabling Haman to kill all the Jews, that they will mobilize the Persian army to kill all the Jews wherever they were. So why was he so offended? And the answer is because Haman not only wanted to kill the Jews, but he struck at the heart of Ahasuerus itself. And therefore he said, this man it's treason what he's doing. Not only does he want to kill the Jews, which I agreed to, but he wants to take my wife from me in some way. And that's why he had Haman killed. So we see a tremendous thing. We begin to understand what it was that provoked Ahasuerus to kill Haman. Finally, we have to understand one more thing. Why was this event so important that Chazal, the sages, made this event into a yontif? What does that mean they made it into a yontif? How were they able to do that? Because Esther simply suggested to them that what they read the story of this event, it should become a yontif in a way. It should have a kedusha. How is that possible? Because you have to understand two things that are very important. First of all, you have to understand who Chazal are and what's the concept of the Rabbanon. Fundamentally, the Rabbanon, the sages of Israel, at that time and until the Amoraim, were not simply sages, men of wisdom, but they were men of extreme sensitivity to spirituality. How is it that they were able to command the Jews to worship on the holiday of Hanukkah and the holiday of Purim? How could Chazal make a yontif of these two times? Because when you say the Megillah and light the Hanukkah candles, what are you doing? You're saying Asher Kichanu b'mitzvosov v'tzivanu. But you're saying that it's God who commanded this. But that's not true. These two holidays of Hanukkah and Purim were ordained by Chazal, by the sages. So what does it mean that God is ordering it? Because God knows that these men who are the sages of Israel, the Nevi'im, the Tanoim, and so on and so forth, were men who could see spiritual forces and they could understand what happens in history. And the reason why Chazal made Hanukkah and Purim into a certain holiday for the Jews and made the Gezerah of Pisum and Isa, that the Jewish people would have to obey the concept of revealing the miracle. How did they understand that it was a miracle? How did they see Purim as a miracle? Were they able to sense a certain hashpor, a shefa? Because what they saw on Hanukkah and Purim, that it was different. It was a historical event, but somehow there was a spiritual force that now entered the universe that never existed before. So on Hanukkah, they made the holiday of the candles to commemorate what? What were they commemorating? That they saw there was a new influence, there was a spiritual power that descended into the physical universe that could be used and made available for the rest of human history. Therefore, they wanted to capture that hashpah, this spiritual force, for good. So by making, on the day of the victory in Hanukkah, by making it into a holiday for Jews, where the Jews would do a mitzvah associated with it, they would be able to capture this hashpah that now originated with Hanukkah, and this hashpah that originated with Purim. So therefore, when Chazal make a certain holiday, it's because they recognize on that day that this is a new hashpah that never existed before in human history. And this hashpah, this energy, comes down to the world. And in order to enable Klal Yisrael to use that energy for the rest of time, they make that energy into a mitzvah. And the mitzvah, the candles of Hanukkah, and the mitzvah of reading the Megillah of Esther, on that day, by doing this mitzvah, by recognizing the miracle was the hashpah. The miracle was not only the event, it was the new shefa of the way God acted, that God would act in a new way, with a new hashpah, that the Jews now could grab, hold on to, and use for the rest of human history. It's a hashpah that would merge with the Jews to assist them in becoming victorious throughout human history. The hashpah of Hanukkah and Purim. And therefore they decreed that Purim would become a holiday. It would be a holiday by doing the mitzvah of reading the Megillah, Kriyas HaMegillah, which would be a revelation of the miracle. So what we have to understand is not how Chazal made Purim into a holiday. They had the power. They had the spiritual power to recognize spiritual events. And what they recognized on Purim, a new spiritual event that never happened before. It was not simply the Jewish people being saved from Haman. That's the way it appears on the surface. But it was the way God related to the Jews in doing this miracle. And therefore they wanted to have this hashpah come down every Purim, so that the Jews can use this hashpah whenever they are in trouble. And they would do that by making this hashpah permanent. When they made the holiday of Purim, the shefa of Purim, and I will describe that in a minute, became a permanent fixture in human history. So the Jews could always avail themselves of this hashpah. So all we have to understand is not how Chazal had the power to create a new Jewish holiday, but what was the hashpah of Purim? And this was very important. What was the hashpah that Purim really represented? Because there were two things that happened on Purim. Not only did Purim represent a new Hashpah, but the Jews did something they never did before. What was that? It says, Kimu v'kiblu, that the Jews finally accepted the Torah fully. You see, at Har Sinai, the Jews accepted the Torah, but they only really accepted this Torah Shebiksav, the written Torah. The Jews did not really want to accept the oral law. That's the fact that the Chazal sages are able to interpret what the law of the Chumash was. They didn't want to accept that. Why not? Because they can accept something comes from God. Yes. So therefore, what God had to do, God wanted to say to them, you have to accept my 613 mitzvahs. But you also have to accept that Chazal, the sages, and the Nevi'im of each generation would have the power to dictate what these laws are, because I will reveal these laws to Moshe Rabbeinu orally. Not only I will write the book, the Torah Shebiksav, I will orally dictate the details of these mitzvahs to the sages, and they themselves will pass them down to Israel. So the sages became an integral part of the Messiah. And this was true of the sages only until the Amoraim. After that, the sages lost that power. But until that time, the sages were an integral part of the interpretation of the Torah. But the Jewish people did not really want to accept them. They accepted what was written in the law. They did not accept really that the sages should have that power. But suddenly on Purim, they accepted this. They finally accepted the intervention of the sages in the Messiah of Torah with their whole heart. Why? Because they saw an amazing thing. They saw who the sages were. They saw that the sages were not simply smarter people and people who are big scholars. They saw them as totally, truly spiritual people. How? Because they saw the sages were responsible for the whole miracle. How did Mordechai even know that there was a decree against the Jews? They didn't publicize that. Achashverosh and Haman never publicized this decree truly. So the question is, how did Mordechai know? And Esther, how did they know this? How did Mordechai know about these two people, these officers of the court who wanted to kill Achashverosh? So they saw that there were sages, human beings, that had the capacity to know spiritual events. And because they had that capacity, they were able to employ certain techniques that they knew, that the sages knew would change the mind of God and suddenly have rachamim. So therefore they saw the sages were true leaders, spiritual leaders, not political or physical leaders. They were not like kings and queens of the world, but they were the spiritual guardians of the Torah itself. So therefore they saw, because the sages themselves were the ones who actually constructed the whole Yeshua, that these were the people that could be relied upon. So suddenly it says, Kimu v'kiblu. Klal Yisrael accepted not only the Torah Shebiksav, what was written, the five books of Moshe Rabbeinu, but they accepted also the intervention of the sages in the interpretations by the Yud Gimel Midas. So that was number one. So by finally accepting what the sages said, they said something else happened what became possible. In the story of Purim, before the story of Purim and so on, it was called, history was called a period of direct access. What was direct access? Where human beings had the ability to know what God was doing. That's right. Why? Because Jews were prophets. The Gemara says that in the time of the first temple, over 1 million Jews were prophets. That's right. Because prophecy was nothing more than a madrega, a certain level which is obtained through a level of Yerushalayim. When you did the avodah by doing the mitzvahs, eventually you could reach the level of what's called prophecy, where you can directly hear God talking to you through a mareh, through a dream. And this was possible for any Jew. So therefore, there were over 1 million Jews who were considered prophets. The reason why we only have 24 of those Jews known, because these Jews had to say things which all the Jewish people had to know to the end of time. So therefore, then the rule was relevant to the history of Klal Yisrael. All the other million prophets knew things that were simply individual and private. So therefore, they didn't write any books. So therefore, only Shmuel, Yirmiyahu, Cheskel, Yeshaya, only they were prophets that we know of, because they had to issue prophecies that would be relevant to the history of Klal Yisrael and what would happen to Klal Yisrael to the end of time. But all the other prophets never had to say anything to the Jews. So therefore, we see that the period from Adam Rishon, the first man, to the last prophet, who was Malachi, who fundamentally was at the time of Purim, or slightly before Purim, that mankind had the ability to relate with God, because they can actually commune with God through a prophetic mechanism, to a prophetic activity. And therefore, I call this period of time direct access. Not only that, when God ever did a miracle for the Jews, he did it in such a way where everyone saw it. The miracles of Egypt was completely publicly known. The miracles of Yehoshua holding up the sun was known. In other words, these were not secrets. There were men who were able to do supernatural events. Even the Goyim, through their Kishuv, could do supernatural events. So this was the era of prophecy. So therefore, there existed the Navi, the prophet. As opposed to the prophet, there was a sorcerer called the Machashev. So therefore, God's interaction with the world was able to be seen and was visible by everyone. And by the time of the story of Purim, God decided to change this period. No longer would he perform miracles that were visible to everyone. That's right. This period of history is called, after Purim, indirect access. That people knew God through chokhmah, through intelligence, through their mind, through their understanding, but they did not have nevuah. Nevuah stopped at that point in history. So history is divided into two periods: direct access, where the Nevi'im, Machashrim, and so on, when there was a much greater openness between God and the Jewish people, and in the later period called indirect access, where the Jews could no longer see God doing miracles. Now the story of Purim was done by who? There wasn't a miracle. The whole story of Purim reads like a novel. In other words, all you see is the involvement of human beings. You don't see the involvement of God. In fact, in the whole Megillah Esther, the name of God is not even mentioned. That's right. Here you have one of the Kisvei Tanakh, in Ksuvim, the Megillah Esther, where the name of God does not even appear. Why? Because God said to the Jews, from now on, you will no longer see visibly with your own eyes what I do to save you. But I will not leave you. I will still do these miracles, but they will all be hidden. There was a new hest upon them. God would disguise his efforts. It's like you're watching a train. When a train goes outside on the tracks, you can see it moving. And when it goes into a tunnel, you cannot see the train. But even though you can't see a train in a tunnel, it's still moving. So God said, I will always be there for you. I will always be there to save you. But only the first part of human history until the story of Purim was I visible. For the second part of human history, which will be the time of the sages, the first part of human history is the time of the prophets, the Nevi'im, and therefore my actions is visible. But the second part of human history, from the time of Purim and onward to the end of time until the Mashiach comes, you will not see what I do. You will feel the results of that, but you will not see me performing. It's a time of sages, chachomim, not Nevi'im, prophets. So God, therefore, the Shefa, the new Shefa that came down at Purim, was one of Hesteponim, where God hides, where you no longer see his intervention in human history. Never again will you have a Pesach until the Mashiach comes, where you will have a holiday where suddenly God reveals his full power, his full control of physical reality. Until the Mashiach comes, never again from Purim and on will you see such an event. The only time that you did see an event was one exception, Hanukkah. Hanukkah was an exception because God still demonstrated an obvious miracle which was visible to all the people. But that was an exception to the rule. Never again did you see anything, any of the actions of God for the Jewish people that would reveal his activity. So therefore, the world went in from a period of the Nevi'im, the prophets, to a period of the sages. So Purim represents a story where Klal Yisrael was able to accept the sages. Before that, they did not trust the sages. Why? Why didn't the Jewish people want to accept the intervention of the sages as part of the Messiah of the Torah? Because very simple, because people have egos. That even the sages are human beings, that even they could make mistakes. So the Jewish people would not devote their loyalty to human beings. They said it's one thing when God says something, when we see the effect, the power of God in front of our eyes, and we say, of course we accept what God says. But how can we accept what humans say? They have egos, they have self-interest, and so on. How can we trust a human being to be so high that he can assist in the Messiah of Torah? So therefore they refused to accept on a technical level. When they said Nasa v'nishma, we will do, and then we will understand, they did not say it when it came to Chazal. They said it when it came to God. But when it came to human beings, when it came to sages, Chachamim, they said, look, these people are like us, and they can make mistakes. So how can we devote ourselves to the loyalty which God requires of us? But on Purim, they finally said, we can trust these people because we see that these people are sensitive to the events of what's happening supernaturally. We had no idea what Haman was going to do. We had no idea how to save ourselves from this. They knew. They were able to see the whole story underneath. They could see what God was doing and how to convince God to be a marachim, to have mercy on us, to save us from Haman. So therefore, now they had the ability to trust man, sages, as people who would be involved in the Messiah. So that's why God instituted it at that time. Because the disbelief in human beings as intermediaries between God and man only existed when it had to do with the Torah Shebiksav, the written Torah. But the Jews refused to give that credibility to the oral law. But now that they saw that God has a new shepherd, God would relate to the Jewish people. How? Through the sages. He himself will be invisible. You will not be able to see what he does, even though he will always be doing it. You would not be able to see it. So therefore, the only option was to trust your sages and certain leaders. And the story of Purim indicates that they could do it. They could trust Mordecai, they can trust Esther, they can trust the Sanhedrin, they can trust their leaders, because the sages were not simply people who are smart, intellectually smart, but they were people who are spiritually sensitive, and therefore they can feel when Klal Yisrael is doing sins. They can feel when Klal Yisrael has ketugim on it, and they can participate in the salvation of Klal Yisrael. So now they can trust them. So therefore, this is Haba Hotalia. This is connected to each other. God was able to convince the Jews that they must accept the credibility of the sages. When he decided no longer to be visible to them, because both are required at the same time. God can only create a substitute for his presence only when the Jews will accept Chazal, when they will accept the sages as proper intermediaries between him and them. And both of these events occurred at the same time. Chazal reached a level of Kimu v'Kiblu where they accepted the Torah Shabi Baal Peh. Why? Because they finally saw who the sages were, that these people were supernatural people, spiritual people, who knew what God was doing, when he would do it, and how to derive mercy instead of din. So now they could trust them. And since the end of the Amoraim, the sages then became the true leaders of Klal Yisrael. Never before were they the true leaders. You see, after them they became the true leaders. The Yizugos, the Tanoim, the Amoraim are all called Chazal, Chachamenu Zichronim Levacha, where the Jews can accept what they say as coming from God, where they can make a bracha on what they say. Asher Kitchanu b'Mitzvot, God who has commanded us on something that the Chazal themselves create. So this was a complete revolution in Judaism. It was not only a revolution in God, in the way God handled the Zulosoi, in the sense that he would no longer allow himself to be visible in acting for their benefit, but it remained a complete revelation on who the sages were. So therefore, the transfer could be taking place. The transfer of the miracles of God could now be given over to human beings, that they would have the ability and the sensitivity to be able to recognize when God was acting, how he was acting, and what would make him act. Suddenly a new credibility arose to the sages of Israel from the performance of Mordechai and the Sanhedrin Agadol and Esther. So this is the true story of Purim. That's why Chazal said they made the holiday of Pesach, of Purim. Why is it that Purim is the only holiday left at the end of time? Because the ultimate Gula, the final Gula, will happen through this concept of Purim, through this Shefa, when God is invisible. Whereas in Mitzrayim, when God first took the Jewish people out of Egypt, everything was open. The plagues, the miracles of the plagues, the miracle of Yam Suf, the miracle of Mount Torah, these are open miracles you could be seeing. It had the hand of God. But at the end of time in the story of Purim, you no longer would see the actions of God from God himself. God was hidden. And instead of God, now the leadership of Klal Yisrael will be sages. And at the end of time, when the Mashiach comes, he will be one of those sages. The Mashiach will be one of those sages and so on. So the Shefa that will bring the Gula Asida, the final Gula, is not the same as the Shefa which brought the story of Pesach. Pesach was brought by a visible God where you can see what he does. But at the end of time, when the Mashiach comes, the Hashpah, the Shefa, the energy that comes down to the world to produce that is hidden. God hides. Hastai esponai. On that day I will surely hide my face. So therefore Purim is our holiday, not Pesach. At the end of time, Purim will replace Pesach. It's the Shefa of Purim, the Hashpah, the energy, the spiritual force of Purim that will dominate the world and will dominate the way God treats the world, not Pesach. So that's why Purim, in the end, becomes the one holiday left on the Jewish calendar at the time of the Mashiach. Why? Because now the Jews give credibility to the sages, and they can accept the invisibility of God in human affairs. Now they can accept it because they can accept the credibility of the sages to replace the open revelation of God himself. So this is the power of Purim. It's an extraordinarily powerful holiday because it represents a juncture in history of God changing the way he interrelates with mankind. In the beginning, God related to man where mankind was much holier and much higher. They had prophets, They are sorcerers. In a certain sense, the life of people who lived before Purim was somewhat magical. But after Purim became very human. And there were no more miracles. And the sages became the leaders of Klal Yisrael. And that's and because that energy and that power now becomes the final power, which with God will redeem the Jews in a state of hidden concealment, that becomes our Yontov. Purim is our Yontov. We have to take advantage of this because we have to understand that God is always there for us, whether He's hidden or whether He's revealed. Even the train in a tunnel is moving. And we have to understand this and accept this, and we have to continuously try and do what? What was the most important feature of Purim, really? The fact that the Jews unified as a people. K'neis es kol Yehudim. It's the unity of the Jews that suddenly gives them power. When God chose the descendants of Avram to influence all of mankind, and through the Jews there would be a blessing. It's only when the Jews are unified that that blessing can actually be activated. When the Jews are separated, when the Jews look at each other in contempt, when the Jews continuously judge each other or steal from each other or whatever it is, when there is this quality called sinas chinam, then what happens? What happens is that the Jews lose their power center. They lose their energy, the supernatural force which guides them. It's gone. It disappears. That's why anti-Semites who are simply goyim have power over us. Because why? Not because they have power over us. It's because we have lost our power. We have lost the power to be redeemed. We have lost the power to redeem ourselves. We have given up that power through our disunity, through our judgment of each other continuously, and our contempt that we have for each other from one Jew to another. And until that stops, that power will not return, except to the final Mashiach who will unify Klal Yisrael. What the final Mashiach will do, which has never really been done, is unify Klal Yisrael, so that Klal Yisrael becomes an organism. Every Jew is another organ in the body, another cell in the body, and it's considered one body. Because in the body is an organism. And what's an organism? An organism is a collection of individuals. That's a team that works together, doesn't work separately. And this is what we have to take away from Purim. K'neis es kol Yehudim. The only reason why Esther was able to be successful, because all the Jews became one people in one goal. Unfortunately, that goal was to save themselves. But we have to listen to Purim. So let this Purim be the final Purim of the world. Let this Purim see the Mashiach. Let him finally come and redeem all the Jews and redeem mankind from the evil that's about to beset it, from all the evil dictators and the evil people who simply want to take over the world and destroy it. Let the Mashiach come finally and reveal the power of God and finally bring down the Shekhinah to the world, the Shekhinah which will unite with the Jewish people and with even Goyim, because they are also entitled to a certain level of Olam Haba. And that the Shekhinah be the centrality of the whole world. And let this Purim be the final indication of that destiny. Okay. Are there any questions?
Thank you.
Amen.
So this is kind of like an aesthetic question. This lack of direct access and hidden miracles seems kind of sad in a way. Why are we celebrating that?
I can't hear you really. Could you speak more clearly?
Sure. I was saying that the transition, the Shefa of Purim, seems to be a sad event because we're it's like a downgrade. It feels like we're losing a Kadosh Baruch Hu from the direct access.
Yes, it is a sad event.
So why are we celebrating?
Because even when something is sad, that does not mean we don't have Yeshua. Even though the Jews did something terrible by the Suda of Achashverosh, they were still redeemed. That's why we celebrate. It's the same thing like a Pidyon Aben. Even though God removed the priesthood from the Bechor and so on and gave it to the Kohanim, it's still a celebration because the Jews can live without a head. Even though our head is chopped off, we still go on and we can live. And God will maintain the promise that in the end, we will be the gatekeepers to Olam Haba. So even though it's sad, true, but there's still a source of joy in the sense that what? That we can always rely on God. That if we are decent in any level, God will spare us and He will bring the eternal destiny of Olam Haba.
The mission continues.
What's that?
The mission continues. It just gets redirected, but the mission continues.
Right.
It doesn't stop. And that is the celebration.
Right.
Shimon, why don't you use your other Yesodis, and you can answer this in a very simple way, that the Choshech, this losing God's direct access, gives him the ability against the Ketrugim to activate Hanhagas HaYichud and the aura of the Geula. So it's sad, but it's also not sad, because this is the guarantee. This Choshech will bring the Geula.
But that's complicated.
But
that's
true. But
it's complicated. I don't want to get into complicated matters if I can explain something in a much simpler way.
Yeah. I'll give you.
But I'm basing this on.
I thank you.
The Torah that you said the 2,000 years
of
Yemot Mashiach. That's all those theories.
Okay. Yeah, but like I said, I'd much rather talk about the consistency of Purim and everything that happens to illustrate that point. But I thank you for your comment. Okay, thank you very much for listening. And Shlomo, please put that on TorahAnytime.com and on YouTube this year. Okay?
Yeah, do you have a name?
The True Story of Purim. Because one of the main features of this year is to indicate what really happened in Purim. Because on the surface, it looks like a strange story about the Jews and Achashverosh and about Haman and about Mordecai. The whole story looks weird, really, when you think of it.
So how about the inner story of Purim?
Well, I said that. I said in a certain way the inner story.
No, I'm saying, say it as a title. It's the title, the inner story of Purim.
Oh, the inner story. Okay, well,
the true inner story of Purim. The true inner story of Purim.
Okay, that's good. The true inner story of Purim.